So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Princeton University sits on land that was forcibly taken from the Lenni Lenape tribe. If it weren't for the pandemic, we would hopefully be at Princeton all together. We can't be together, but at least we can get together on Zoom and learn some stuff. We'd also like to acknowledge that the pandemic and the climate crises that we're talking about are intertwined, and they disproportionately impact Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Divest Princeton really wants to be a part of the movement towards a more just world. This is actually a really great day for Divest Princeton, which is a coalition of alumni, students, faculty, staff that have all come together, parents. It started 1 year ago today. So today is the 1 year anniversary. Two alums got together and were really thinking, what could they do? So they created a letter and wrote to Princeton and said that they wouldn't give a donation again until Princeton divested from fossil fuels. So a year later, more than 1,600 people, alumni, students, faculty, and staff have signed that letter. So that's pretty incredible, and it shows how one little thing can grow into a pretty cool thing. More than 40 campus organizations have endorsed, and every day there are more endorsements and more people signing on. So pretty cool. You can find out about all of this at divestprinceton.com. We have an amazing website. Our previous talks are also there, and this one will go up there as well. You can also sign the letter if you haven't already, and you can publicly endorse the campaign. One of the things that we really want to do at Divest Princeton is forge partnerships and create dialogue at Princeton. So we are really grateful to the Princeton University Energy Association for co-sponsoring today's talk with us. Musab is going to tell you all about PUEA, but it's a very cool organization that wasn't there when Rohit and I were there, but is now doing very, very interesting things. So I'm going to hand it over to Musab, and thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And you say that you're thankful to us. I think this is reciprocated and also, I guess, enhanced from us. We're more thankful to have you on our side, both. Sorry, can everyone hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry, I thought the screen froze for a second. But yeah, just hello, everyone. My name is Musab. I'm a junior in the electrical engineering department. I joined PUEA since my first year. A little about PUEA. We are an organization dedicated to energy education. We're fairly young, like Lynn said. We have been operating since I think 2015 or 2016. And really, you can ask us, I guess, what our objective is. And it really boils down to learning about energy through dialogue and also diverse perspectives. Having been, I guess, a member in for 2.5 years by now, I think the thing I enjoy the most about it is the fact that we welcome people from all different majors, all different backgrounds, all different, I guess, interests in what they want to do. And really, I think that's what sets us apart from, I guess, the energy program at Princeton. We try to bring together voices to, I guess, work to solve problems. And that's really what we're seeing here. We're seeing Lynn, who is an active member of Divest, who is a hero, a champion of, I guess, promoting environmentalist policies, specifically that of divestment, which I think is really important in this day and age. And Rohit, who's a very distinguished alumni, talking about his experience. And I really want to encourage everyone to really see this as more of a conversation. Know that your students, or even if you're not students, you have those lectures where you go watch stuff, and they're all, I guess, introspective and learning based and everything. But this is really a conversation that you can have with me and Rohit, who's our guest of honor, but also me and Lynn, since we are, I guess, the people who are kind of trying to tie together both the idea of energy and divestment. So I think without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Rohit. A little bio. Rohit is a clean energy venture capitalist and a public narrative and organizing coach, focusing on climate justice. He was previously director of innovation at Powerhouse, a clean energy and mobility venture capital fund based in Oakland, California. He has held roles at Breakthrough Energy Ventures and in investing in impact evolution at Acumen in Nairobi and New York. So you have two very different, very great cities that he has experience in. So lots of conversations there, hopefully. He has an MBA from MIT Sloan and an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School, and as a proud member of the class of 2011. So really not too far off. So hopefully we can get a lot of very relatable experiences from there. But yeah, without further ado, I'll leave it to you, Rohit.
Yeah, thank you so much, Musab, and thank you, Lynn. I'm very excited to be here and honestly quite honored that so many people would voluntarily join another Zoom call today after probably sitting through lectures. And, if you have a job, someone's paying you to be on Zoom calls and no one's paying you right now. So I'm really, really honored and just happy to share some of my experiences and anything I can, hopefully you can learn a little bit from my journey. So I'm just going to share my screen and we'll try to keep, my portion short and just leave a lot of time for questions because I know that a lot of times the most interesting part are just what I'm really curious what you are interested in learning. Um, a quick intro about me. So I'm currently in Oakland, California, which is on originally was Ohlone land, and have been thinking a lot about the indigenous people and native approaches to environment and climate management. So as many of you know, the past few months and years really have been catastrophic in California for wildfires. And as people are now relearning, the indigenous people have had a really strong way of managing and protecting the environment from fire. And we have to relearn that. And so when we think about innovation and technology and equity, it really pops up in so many different ways and in so many places that I think are relevant to today. So I'm going to kind of try to breeze through my agenda. So I'll start with my story, then talk a little bit about the opportunities in clean energy from my perspective, go through a potentially helpful framework. You tell me if it's helpful afterwards. Just how to think about, if you're interested in clean energy and technology, just like what's a way to categorize a sector. And then go through a few startups and organizations to watch. Just wanted to share some organizations that you may not be familiar with, but could be a really interesting place to look. And then jump into questions. Cool. So my story. So obviously everything starts at Princeton, so I'll just start there. I actually grew up right outside Princeton in a small town called Cranberry. So if anyone's ever on the Turnpike, exit 8A. And I really thought a lot about climate for the first time in undergrad. So thinking back actually to fall semester freshman year, I took a freshman seminar in the geoscience department in Geo Hall. Is Geo Hall still there? Am I that old yet? The one across from Frist? I think it's still there. The one with
Actually,
the
yes,
dinosaur?
yes, it is. But the funny story is, Princeton has decided to allocate that space to the computer science department. So
Oh man.
a lot of geo students are really salty about that. But that's not
Oh man, okay. Okay. Well, I just remember walking in that building and just being like, this is so cool. Um, and so that class, it was transformative for me because fall break, we went to actually Eastern California. We went to the Sierra Nevadas for like a field visit and a field trip. And it was pretty amazing seeing climate change up close in actual physical evidence. So we did this experiment where we did tree cores up and down the mountain and examined growth rates of trees. We looked at like water levels in local lakes and understood that temperatures have been rising. And it was really such a hands-on experience that I think you can only get at a place like Princeton. And so a reminder that like we're all very privileged and have just to have these opportunities. And I hope that we can all kind of put them to good use and like learn from it and keep applying these lessons in our own careers. And the second part at Princeton that I wanted to mention was so when I applied to my major, which was also like Lynn, what is now the School of Public Policy and International Affairs, back then you had to apply. And my application essay, I just looked it up, was about something called climate policy, which I had no clue what that was at the time, but I knew I was interested in it. So I really was interested in, how will countries that are still developing, that don't have as many resources as like the US or Europe, how will they adapt to climate change? Like, what will they do? How are we not going to totally kind of mess up the planet while still giving people the opportunity to thrive? And it was that international component that led me to my first job at Acumen, which is a nonprofit that is also an investor in social enterprises. So Acumen supports social enterprises that serve the poor in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. And it was really amazing for me, like as a first job out of college, because they were really working on big problems. And I had really never been interested in the public sector at Princeton, sorry, in the private sector at Princeton at all. I had no intention to go into business. I never thought I'd ever get an MBA. I thought investors were like these evil people. And when I was at Acumen, I saw a new way to invest, right? So this was taking money, putting it into businesses that were providing healthcare, housing, water, sanitation, renewable energy. And they weren't necessarily interested in a return. They were interested in a social impact return. So it was just a different way to think about how do you create impact in the world. And with Acumen, I got an amazing experience to to move to Kenya. So I was in Nairobi for 2 years with the Acumen team. I'm helping launch like a new program for them. And it was in East Africa where I really started to see how climate change and poverty were connected. So a lot of our work was with energy companies that were trying to sell, affordable solar lighting or microgrid services or clean cook stoves to communities that didn't have access to energy. And I'll talk a little bit later about just the scale of that problem. But for me, it was really about meeting individuals and households that were facing this problem firsthand. So I remember meeting a farmer named Faith, and she was in central Kenya in Thika province. And I was there visiting her as part of one of our investments and just trying to understand like how has she been impacted by our work. And we were talking and kind of standing on a hill in her farm. And I was asking her like, how are things going? What are the problems you're facing? How has our work helped? And she looks at me and she goes, I'm a good farmer. I have 10 cattle, which is a lot for that region. I farm 2 acres and I'm doing well. But every year the drought gets worse. And every year our crops turn brown faster than the year before. And no one is really sure why, but we know it's happening. And who's going to help my family and my children when it's their turn to farm this land and the drought is all year round? And that moment for me was something where I just saw, this concept of climate change we talk about so abstractly sometimes is actually very personal. And for so many people, they're directly affected by it. And so that really became a guiding kind of force for my career. And I ended up, leaving Acumen and going back to grad school to really become an expert in this stuff. So I did end up getting an MBA, much to the chagrin of my 21-year-old self. And then I did a joint master's at the Harvard Kennedy School in public policy. And this is where I really thought about like, how do you make systemic change, right? How do you use business? How do you use policy to dive into what is the future of energy globally? While I was there, I worked at this great organization called Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a very large VC fund started by Bill Gates and his billionaire buddies, who basically were like one day, actually on the sidelines of the Paris Climate Accords, they basically were like, okay, we have billions of dollars. How can we solve climate change? And certainly a lot of hubris in that room. But interestingly, they actually put the money up. So Breakthrough Energy Ventures invests in sort of hard tech solutions, like really difficult science and engineering problems that can scale to a huge level. So they have a goal where every investment they make has to be capable of displacing at least 1% of global emissions, which if you do the math, turns out to be about half a gigaton. That is a huge number. Half gigaton is, approximately like 100 to 200 gigawatts of solar on the grid. And if you think about it, there's only 800 gigawatts of solar globally today, like ever installed. So they're really trying to like revolutionize the whole sector. And it was an amazing experience. I think it's just a lot of smart people trying to figure out ways to make a difference. After grad school, I ended up at a firm called Powerhouse, which is in the bottom right. And they're like kind of the opposite of Breakthrough. So they're a small fund. They're only $7 million. and they work with mostly software startups. So these are companies trying to transform like the business models of clean energy. And I'm happy to talk more about like, what that looks like, and what the jobs are in that career, in that sector, and the difference between like hardware investing versus software investing. So what did I learn? I think I talked about this a little bit before, but the biggest thing I learned was that climate and energy are fundamentally about people. These, like, we tend, especially in universities, we really tend to think about this as like a technical problem. Like, okay, we have X amount of emissions left. We have to reduce Y per year. And so like, what are the numbers we can calculate? So what should we invest in? What should we fund? But I think we cannot forget that the reason we're doing all of this is to save our culture and to save people we know and to impact real communities that are facing these problems every day. And I think where people get lost is in like finding this cool new technology that will solve everything, or funding the right business at the right time that will change the whole world. And this is like companies like Tesla, where they've achieved a ton, but sometimes they can just get totally off track because they're more obsessed with the technology than they are with the impact. So I think that's one thing I've been trying to remember, and something that I hope that you think about as well. Okay, so where are the opportunities in the sector? One way of asking that question is, how long do we have, right? What is the time frame of the solutions that we're looking for? So for clean energy and for climate overall, a widely accepted year date is 2050. You hear this all the time, like by 2050 X, by 2050 this will happen. So that's what I kind of call the climate crisis breaking point. Like if we haven't figured it out by 2050, we're really in for it, and it's going to be really bad. So, how does that affect you? Well, interestingly, your careers, if you're an undergrad right now, will span approximately the next 40, 45 years, right? You'll be still working, but the peak of your career is basically going to be the same overlap as the climate crisis. And in one ways that's terrifying, but in other ways, it's a really interesting opportunity. Like you can spend your whole career working on this, and by the end of it, we'll know if it'll work or not, right? We'll have actually a really interesting set of outcomes by then, or we won't. And I think it's just a huge opportunity to see your career in a new way, that like this can be the generation that really changes how the world works. And we have to, because there's really no other choice. Okay, so this is going to be tough because you guys can't actually participate in this experiment, but let's look at some of these numbers. So can anyone see, this graph is like a representation of the sources of all energy that humans produce and consume on the planet. It's the left, the axes are percent over time. And can anyone see where renewables are? Like where is clean energy in this graph?
Rohit, I did want to mention that people can like send things in the chat, and we can always, I guess, like relay them.
Oh, great.
So if you want to participate, this is everyone's chance.
Yeah, this is a quick quiz.
Anyone? Okay, someone says yellow and teal.
Yellow and teal, okay. Sliver of yellow, yeah. Basically, it's really hard to see. It's that, yeah, it's that tiny sliver of yellow is like, I think the category is solar, comma, wind, comma, etc. And it is like extremely small right now. Biofuels and waste is debatably renewable. Nuclear, we can have that conversation after. I'm happy to talk about it. I'm mixed on it, but essentially it's really small, right? And that is another way of saying like, we have to decarbonize all of this energy supply by 2050 if we want a real shot of creating a sustainable planet. And one way to look at it is terrifying, but it's also a huge opportunity. Like all of these sectors will need to be decarbonized, and your careers will be the ones that will do it. And so I think it's like, as an investor, like you want to see opportunity in like massive scale, and this is really massive scale.
Just to be clear, was
Sure.
that the US? Was that domestic or worldwide?
This is global.
Okay, even more scary.
Yeah, even more scary. Yeah. So just like a few kind of ways I think about the opportunity. So renewables are only about 10% of the energy supply, and most of that is large-scale hydro, which is really going away for a lot of reasons, and nuclear. But the electricity sector is rapidly decarbonizing, and transportation is close behind. So I'm sure there are a bunch of classes, like I took MAE 228, which I'm not sure is still offered, Energy of the 21st Century. But we learned about like how fast solar is dropping. And in that class, those predictions, this was over 10 years ago, those predictions were wildly wrong. They were way too conservative. Solar has outperformed cost curves basically every time. So whenever anyone makes a 5-year prediction about how cheap solar will be in the next 10 years, it's always too conservative. So solar has really dropped much faster than anyone has predicted. And batteries are now becoming down that curve as well. So if you look at the battery cost curve, it's really becoming a lot cheaper over time. At the same time, we know that 1 billion people don't have access to safe, clean, and reliable energy. 600 million of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. That is a ton of people. And again, it's an opportunity. Like we need to build the infrastructure in a place like Kenya, in a place like India, that doesn't exist yet. And instead of kind of, trying to build the same infrastructure we have in the US or Europe, and then converting it over time to something more sustainable, why not just start with what's cheapest and most sustainable today? And so those problems are really gnarly. It's a lot of politics, it's a lot of financing, it's a lot of technology, but again, it's a huge opportunity. And as we see in a place like China, China has like really veered from being a very coal dependent country to now understanding like, okay, we need to phase all of this out and move to solar and wind. So that's a big opportunity. And then last is just money. So Project Drawdown, which is a great resource, they have this sort of calculation that an initial cost of about 20 trillion will repay to about 100 to 150 trillion over time for all the sort of climate change solutions. So it really is a big money opportunity as well. Just thinking about solar, so this is global growth of cumulative solar since 2006. So I took MAE 228 in 2009, and so you can see where installed solar was then. It's not even, you can't even see it, right? And now we're gonna hit, right, 800 gigawatts this year. And I think what's interesting about this is like, in venture capital, I see graphs like this all the time for companies' growth projections. Like every company basically has some version of this graph. Like, yeah, in 5 years, we'll be 100x where we are today. And it's pretty amazing when an industry actually does it. So solar has been doing that and will continue to do it. So even though it's small, it's growing rapidly, and there's really no end in sight for how fast it'll grow. Okay, so here is the potentially helpful framework. So we have this big problem. We know there's a lot of opportunities. So how do you think about it as an individual, right? Where do you jump in? This is a great framework from Project Drawdown, which is a really interesting nonprofit that is trying to understand, like, what do we do, right? What do we do about the climate crisis? So on the left here, you'll see the sources of emissions. So 25% approximately is electricity. Another 25% is food and agriculture, which people often overlook as a huge part of the energy system. Industrial use is 20%. Transportation is 14%. Buildings are 6%. And then 10% is like basically everything else. And then on the right side, you'll see what they call sinks, right? So the left is sources and the right is sinks. So sinks are like, how does carbon get out of the atmosphere? And so if you're trying to build a career in this sector, you can think about, do I want to be on the left side and help reduce sources? So maybe I want to like decarbonize electricity and work on deploying solar and wind or other forms of low carbon electricity sources. Do I want to make agriculture more sustainable, right? Do we want to figure out how do we reduce, like cattle production is a huge chunk of that. Land use, right? Like farming practices are really bad as well. Industry is really interesting. It's a really tough, but there's a lot of emissions created in industry. Transportation is obvious, right? Like electric vehicles are a huge sector right now. And a lot of money is being spent figuring out how do we make electric EVs work. The other side is that you can work on the sink side, right? So there's a lot of interesting companies starting to think about like, how do we plant more trees, right? How do we increase the amount of forestry sinks? How do we like help people offset their carbon emissions by, deploying like more sources of sinks? Like, so there's a really cool company called Nori, Nori, which is helping farmers use different farming practices to trap carbon in the soil. So these are things that we used to do as a civilization for a long time. And it's only recently during modern agriculture where we really started getting away from that. So there's a lot of really interesting work. And one potentially helpful way to think about it is like, what side do you want to play on? And then within that, what are the things that really make a difference? Cool. The last part of like how you want to be in, oh, thank you, Musab. Yeah. So the other thing about like, what are the opportunities and how do you want to operate in this sector is equity and justice. So I think equity and justice should drive how this transition should happen. And for a few reasons. So back to this idea that climate is all about people. And a big part that we're seeing now is that the impacts of climate change are having wildly different effects on people based on things like where they live, their zip code in the US, their race in the US is a big one. And then outside of the US, like, poor countries, unfortunately, are facing the brunt of this. So lots of huge parts of sub-Saharan Africa are drying out. Like drought is at its peak in East Africa and the Horn of Africa for the last few years. Similarly in South Asia, like Bangladesh is being hit by storms every year. So the burden, that's how you kind of talk about it in the sector, is like the climate burden is very high on people who can least afford it. And there's some really interesting research coming out, at least in the US, about this. So the one on the left is a new report that just came out last month about how low-income households and communities of color spend a much larger percent of their income on energy than any other household once you control. And so we're seeing sort of like a lot of impacts of legacy racism in the US and things like housing stock. So weatherization is a big problem. Old housing is way less efficient than new housing. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of resources. And this organization, ACEEE, is a really good one. And the one on the right is a really interesting study about rooftop solar. So this study found that Black households were like 60 or 70% less likely to live in a neighborhood that had even one house with solar PV on the roof. Latinx households were 30% less likely compared to white households when you control for income, when you control for all the zip code like effects. So this is kind of saying that there is a big social network and a lot of reasons based on race why people can't access solar. And I think we have to solve these problems before we can even think about climate as a whole, a sort of global system problem as well. Okay, so now like what are your opportunities, right? So as an undergrad or grad student or like someone in their early career, what are different ways you can actually jump in? This is a incomplete list, so my apologies, but this is how I think about like career options. So there's like a whole bunch of research options. So universities, government, the national lab system is really amazing. So if you're a researcher, if you're into science, if you're into engineering research, like the national labs are the place to be in energy because they've put out some of the biggest innovations in the clean energy sector. And there were a lot of startups come out of. So a lot of your like more technical hardware driven startups come out of some form of government or university funding. Yeah, then there's startups. So startups like recruit basically everyone, engineers, people in finance, policy, operations, sales is a big one. Also, there are a lot of science-oriented startups that would need like really great researchers. That's a huge world and it's growing really fast. So venture capital is really flooding into clean tech again. And hopefully to stay this time, we can, if you're interested in that, we can talk about what happened last time. But the startup scene is really booming, and it could be a really cool place to get a lot of experience very quickly. Funders, I have a whole slide on that next, so we can skip that for now. NGOs and ecosystem enablers. So this is stuff that I wasn't really aware of. So there are a lot of organizations that are helping like promote clean energy innovation. So I just listed a few of them here. New Energy Nexus, which is based in Oakland, Rocky Mountain Institute and EDF, Environmental Defense Fund. They have great programs that are trying to fund more innovation in clean energy. Greentown Labs is based in Somerville, right outside Boston. They're like a co-working space and incubator for startups working on really hard clean energy problems. So there's a whole world of, if you don't want to work at a startup, these are companies and organizations that help startups grow and sort of give them the resources they need. Policy, like this is government, this is state level, local level, city government, could be really interesting. A lot of think tanks are now thinking about, so Project Drawdown is kind of one of these more policy oriented NGOs. That's a really good space to land. And then industry. So this is like more traditional industries. So like oil and gas, their traditional renewable industry. These are companies like SunPower, Sunrun, Tesla, I guess now. And then utilities. So utilities are really interesting, pretty tough, I would say, to navigate into your early career. It's like, I think if you find good ones, they can have some interesting programs. So like National Grid in the Northeast is pretty good. They have a cool young professional program. PG&E out here in California used to be really good, but the wildfires really have taken a huge toll on that organization. And then happy to talk about like how I see the more conventional like oil and gas industry playing in clean energy, if that's of interest. I think you have to be careful and just look at kind of historically how important has clean energy investment been for some of the oil and gas majors. So kind of my experience has been that the American companies like Exxon, Chevron have not been very good about this, and they've done really great marketing campaigns, but when push comes to shove, they're not really investing much. Whereas a lot of the European majors like Total, Shell, what used to be Statoil, but is now, I'm just blanking on their name, but the Norwegian one, like they're all really investing a ton of money and have people who I think are outside the sector who are trying to bring in innovation. So yeah, happy to jump more into that if there are more questions there. Funders. So really quickly here, just thinking about like, within energy innovation and startups, there's like a whole swath of organizations that are playing some role in the funding landscape. So on the left is incubators and accelerators, things that are really for early stage companies. In the middle, you have VCs and CVCs, which is corporate venture capital. So these are venture funds started by corporations. And on the right, you have your more traditional private equity and like financing arms. So if you are interested in being on the financing side, there's a lot of different ways you can jump in. Like the folks on the left will be more about like the technology, the founder, the idea, the market. Whereas the folks on the right will be more about like the financial viability, profitability, like looking a little bit more like a traditional finance role. But they're still doing some innovative stuff in like how do you finance a new sector like clean energy.
Rohit, just to someone sent a question in the chat, and I do want to open up, I guess, that sort of culture. Feel free to, I'm sure, Rohit, that's but Anisha asks, could oil and gas companies play roles in transition to CCS? I'm sure you kind of, I guess, covered that, but is there anything else you wanted to add about that?
Yeah. So I think can they play roles in a transition to CCS? Yeah, I mean, certainly they have a big role to play. And my kind of experience has been I think a lot of folks who are like renewable energy, what I will call fanatics. Take that as you will. I might put myself in that category sometimes. But they have this tendency to like throw everyone who works at an oil and gas company under the bus, as if like they're all evil people. And I just really don't think that's true based on my own experience. Like, especially in business school, there are so many extremely intelligent engineers, intelligent business people who have worked to grow oil and gas companies and who are now really interested in like, how do we transition them? So I just want to make a distinction from the people who work at oil and gas companies and then like the corporate management, because I think it's really the corporate management, and it's like they control these companies, they have a lot to say in like how they in their strategic direction, and that's the level you kind of have to look at as to like whether you want to work with them or not. So I do think like there are like some of the best energy engineers in the world are at oil and gas companies, and they could be prioritizing things like carbon capture storage. I would say though, it's really hard to tell from the outside, like what a company's incentives are, what a company's real motivation is. Like CCS can be very tempting, but I still think I'm still wondering like why we want to invest in that over other things, right? And I think at the end of the day, we'll need a combination of many, many different technologies. But I think it's helpful to look at like, why is a company really promoting one solution over the other? It's usually because it's in their own interest. So I think like just being a little bit careful of like who is behind some of these campaigns and who is behind some of these technologies. Cool. Oh, a question about BP's net zero pledge. Great. And then do we think strategies like purchasing offsets are worthwhile or not tackling the root of the issue? Okay, love this question. And actually, I'll jump into this now because I actually have worked with BP, and it's a really fascinating, it's a really fascinating story. So BP, like they have a new CEO who seems to be a lot more serious about this pledge. And I think that's where it's actually coming from, is this new CEO. I think the question is like, is the rest of the company on board? And that's remains to be seen. But they are trying to put a lot more money in it. I'm a little skeptical of like what net zero means for a company like an oil company, because the second part of your question, Masi, is like, are purchasing offsets good enough, right? I think that it's a really good start, and we need to start thinking about like the sinks. If we think about the right side of the diagram from before, like how do we increase that side? But we can't just focus on the sinks for emissions without tackling the sources, because otherwise you'll never catch up, right? Like an offset and increasing carbon sinks will never be enough to actually solve the problem. So you have to do both sides. And that's where like we'll see, BP made this pledge, Shell made a pledge. I think Total already made a pledge. A lot of the European majors are making these pledges. And so we'll see like where they end up, right? Can they actually invest enough to make that difference on the sources side? Cool. Okay, great. I love this other question from Vedika. I'm actually going to jump into case studies, and we'll get to that specific question on emerging markets and like what the consumer products are like. Cool. So wanted to just like click through a few case studies from the startup world, just so you get an idea of like what are the startups out there, how do they work, how do they progress, like what can you do in some of them. So I picked 3, which are obviously not representative, or they're not comprehensive, but hopefully represent like some level of diversity across the sector. So Form Energy, this is one that's getting a lot of buzz recently. They're creating a long duration battery storage using aqueous air technology, which is like a fancy word of saying they have invented some proprietary battery chemistry that they think will work a lot better than the ones that are out there, which is probably true if you look at who their funders are. And they're tackling this problem of like long duration storage for intermittent renewables. So I'm sure if you've taken classes on this, basically there are days when the sun is not shining or the wind isn't blowing. And so if our whole grid is tied to these resources, what do we do? right? People still want to use electricity. So Form is creating a battery that can store energy, at least for now, up to 150 hours. I know they're trying to hit like 500 hours over the long term to solve this problem. So if you have a bunch of these batteries in the grid, this can be your storage for those times when supply won't match demand. So they're currently in Series B on the sort of funding stage. They've raised $50 million. They're funded by Breakthrough Energy Ventures, by MIT, by one of the Italian oil majors, Eni. And just thinking about their path to success, like as you look at startups, there are certain markers that I think are pretty important in the clean energy world. So Form came out of a lab at MIT. There's this amazing professor there, Yet-Ming Chang, who is like the battery guru. And he has started like 2 or 3 battery companies, and he's really at the cutting edge. So it's a lot of his technology that's in this company. That's the genius I put in the slide. So he helped create the battery chemistry. They went out and found a really experienced founder. So Matteo, who used to be at Tesla, to actually run the company. And then the last thing they did, which is really interesting, was they've built this battery hardware, but they've also come up with a really interesting software product to actually manage the battery. So that's one of the big problems in the industry, is that the software is really far behind the hardware. So, if you're a utility, it's nice to have all these resources, but it's a lot more complicated than just turning things on and off, right? So the software is catching up, and that's what a company like Form can actually play a really big role, because they have created their own software that they're actually selling already. Lynn, yes, does Form Energy move away from lithium? Yeah. So that is, I think that is part of their technology, is that it's not lithium based, partially because of these reasons, but also because lithium batteries are much more suitable for short-term energy storage. So thinking like, your laptops or electric vehicle, where you don't need these like hundreds of hours of storage. And so there's a whole class of batteries that are not lithium based. So like sulfur based batteries, like molten salt batteries, which are pretty interesting. Yeah, so that's Form Energy. One like archetype of a really successful hardware company. Second is d.light Design. So this goes back to the other question that Vedika had about emerging economies. So this is exactly that, right? B2C models where d.light has designed an ultra low cost solar light for developing countries. They've raised almost $200 million. They're in 80 countries. They've served like 100 million customers. Really interesting funders. And they came out of a design class at Stanford. And they just really have been at it for a long time. Like they've been working on this for 15 years. And that's how long it takes to build some of these companies. And I think what's cool about d.light is they're really targeting the bottom of the pyramid consumer, because there's no other solution for them. So they just saw this huge opportunity in energy that people were just too afraid to tackle, honestly. So your question, what are the major challenges for B2B solutions? Do they need to be de-risked, more capital, research, policy changes? Yeah, the short answer to that is like all of the above, unfortunately. So definitely more capital. Honestly, scientific research for some of these solutions, I don't think that's the bottleneck right now. I think for a lot of this, we know actually, and we have a lot of the technology. It's more like creating it, making it affordable, and making it like accessible. So that's maybe where the engineering or science problems are. And policy changes for sure. Like, so many of the reasons why a country, countries like Kenya or Uganda don't have electricity it's just like public policy, and they didn't have the resources and like will to actually do it. And so right now all these companies are playing catch up, which is not a great place to be in. Okay, last case study is a company called Solstice. So they're based in Boston, actually started by 2 Princeton grad students. And they're deploying community solar for households unable to access renewables. So like 70% of Americans cannot install solar on their rooftop. And so they're missing out on the savings, they're missing out on all the benefits. And so community solar is a mechanism to actually like put solar in your community and then have it widely shared among residents. So it's a way to democratize energy in some ways. And so you actually don't need these giant utility scale developments anymore. You don't need like huge developments to bring solar into your community. So it's kind of a challenge to the existing system, and I'm really curious to see how it goes. But one thing they've done that's interesting is they've innovated on credit scoring. So they've created a new type of credit score to evaluate households based on how they repay utility bills. And what that does is it really opens up access to a lot more households who traditionally would be locked out of the market. And so they're really trying to expand down into low-income households, like and households with other challenges that can't get solar. Cool. That's all I got. I talked for a long time, but I love these questions, so keep them coming.
Yeah, so we have a question from Omar Javed, and the question is, by the way, I apologize if I get anyone's name wrong, but anyway, in what areas problems can software make the biggest difference? I think this is really important because in Princeton, the largest major by far is computer science. And I think it's no surprise that that's like one of the biggest career paths that people go on to, whether it's in a big company, a startup, or a non-tech company. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love this question. I think software is going to be huge because essentially so much of the funding and research has gone into hardware for a very good reason. And actually hardware is still pretty underfunded. But a lot of your traditional software startups haven't seen energy as a great market for various reasons. So that means I think there's a dearth of solutions. So I think the biggest problem I see, at least in the US, is the transmission distribution system. And software can play a huge role in that. So like, how do you manage the grid? It's a really complex question. And a lot of utilities are very, very scared right now because they don't really have the technology to do it. So if you go into some of these older like utility control rooms, they're using programs like planning programs from decades ago because they just haven't ever upgraded it. So there's a really cool class of startups targeting the distribution problem and trying to help utilities, trying to help other big companies develop software solutions that can scale. And there's a lot of like machine learning in that as well. The other part I would say is climate risk. So we're seeing some cool machine learning climate risk companies who are trying to model much more microclimate issues. So like, let's say let's like you own a house and you want to understand what is the fire risk for my house. Right now, it's basically impossible. Like there are no models out there. But there's a few startups. One is called Terrafuse that is based out in Berkeley. They're really interesting. There's a few more that are using like that kind of technology to really get a much better sense of how do we model climate change.
There was an anonymous question that asks, what are your thoughts on fracking? By the way, whoever asked that a while ago, so I apologize that it took me a while to get to, but here you go.
Yeah, I love it. I'm glad it's anonymous so that whoever this person is, I can't come find them afterwards. No, fracking. Yeah, I mean, I guess like there's so many parts to fracking, and like I definitely have a lot of thoughts on many of them. I would say like what I imagine this person is trying to get at is like, should we have fracking, yes or no? And I don't think that's the right question because we already have fracking and it's a huge part of, at least in the US, it's a huge part of the energy economy. So it's not just going to go away overnight. And so people who are talking about banning fracking, a lot of what they're talking about is banning new drilling. It's about halting dangerous drilling. And that I'm actually very for. Like, I think fracking as a concept is, if you think about it, like if it's your house and let's say someone comes to you and said, hey, I'm going to pay you a few $1,000. I'm going to dig a hole that's 1,000 feet deep, pump really hot liquids down it, and then extract natural gas and then pipe it away. And you'll have this big drainage ditch next to your house that may or may not contain contaminated water. Like, I don't think you'd sign up for that, right? And so I don't see why we need to invest in technologies like that when there are many other alternatives. So I think fracking is like, it's not going to go away, but I don't also think we need to pour a whole bunch of money down it at the same time.
Rohit, I think it's really funny that you mentioned that, because whoever watches BoJack Horseman knows that that's the exact plot of one of the episodes. Sorry about that. But
Really?
yeah, no, it's hilarious.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, just someone wants to plug something relevant, which is Steve Spires, co-founder and CEO of Solstice, has a Bradford seminar coming up on Monday.
Oh,
I'll
cool.
forward the link. Yeah, sorry to take some of your time, just wanted to mention that. All right, anonymous attendee asks, would you be able to provide a few examples of startups working on solutions for grid management?
Yeah, certainly. Let's see. So one that's really cool in California is called Ohm Connect. I can put it in the chat here. It's kind of like, there's this whole thing called demand response, which is a very like electricity nerd concept, but essentially Ohm Connect is making it easy for customers, like people like you and me, to respond to when the grid is like crowded, or essentially like overburdened. So it's a way for like customers to start sharing in some of the revenue that you can generate if you basically like turn down your air conditioner or unplug stuff. That's a really cool one. Another great grid one is called Pearl Street Technologies. Chicago, there's one in New York called Amperon. Amperon is really interesting because they're working in deregulated markets and are trying to help understand like the best strategy to deploy renewables or other assets on the grid. So that's a really cool one. Yeah, I would say like one great way to find startups is to think about like who are the investors that are backing them, and then just look at their portfolios. So if I go back to this slide, like the one right in the middle, Congruent Ventures backs a lot of really interesting software startups in energy. I would say the Elemental Accelerator portfolio, which is under accelerators, they have a huge portfolio, a lot of really good startups that are growing or successful. It's a great source as well.
All right, up next we have a question. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll through. Do you think, from Christopher Bergine, I'm really sorry if I'm getting the name wrong, but the question is, do you think climate change solutions and renewable energy occupies the proper position in current politics and administrative priorities? If not, do you think it needs to be of the utmost concern on a national level? It needs to be of the utmost concern on a national level will accelerate change. I think it's important because we're looking at an election about 2 weeks from now, and it's definitely an issue in politics. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
As a venture capital?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for asking that, Christopher. Yeah, short answer is yes. I think it definitely needs to be the highest concern at a national level. But I will caveat by saying that like the traditional sort of climate organizations have been very narrowly focused on like emissions without really understanding or trying to connect it to things like equity and jobs and like transportation and all like healthcare. Like all of those things are climate issues in my mind. And so that's why I love the idea of a Green New Deal. Like I really do think that it's one of the most important changes in the last 2 years is that the idea of a Green New Deal has become mainstream, because the whole point is like, climate change and like emissions are one part of it, but actually this is about a jobs guarantee. It's about student debt. It's about like, how do we manage our land? How do we like manage our resources? And so it really, I think that does need to be on the top of mind for any like political candidate. And I do think like if you are interested in that, an organization that I've actually been volunteering with recently is called Sunrise Movement. And they're like a youth movement that is like pushing the Green New Deal, getting young people involved in advocacy, in climate politics, getting people who never thought of themselves as like climate people interested and kind of like invested in the outcome of a lot of this stuff.
Okay, that's great. There's a question that I think is on the surface very simple, but I do want to hear about it. Just I guess, as a sanity check. And that's from Tom, and he asks, what role does divestment from fossil fuels play in the future of clean energy?
Yeah, it's a great question. Definitely not a surface level question. So I think it's just specifically asking like maybe what is the impact of divestment and divestment policies on clean energy? And I think it could have a impact. And like, you know, for me, I really believe in divestment as a strategy, more in like a symbolic way. So an institution like Princeton, like has a big voice, and like all of the academic institutions I've gone to, like Harvard, MIT, Princeton, none of them have divested publicly. And I think if those three did, it would really change the conversation at a national level, about climate and about fossil fuels and the role in our society. In terms of that impact on clean energy, I think it could have an impact. But I think that a lot of the capital is going to come into the sector regardless of divestment. So I think, you know, if a big firm or like big pension funds really started taking it seriously, you could see more flows into clean energy. But at the end of the day, a lot of these funds are really making like just pure financial decisions. So they're going to evaluate sectors based on what they think is going to happen in that sector independently, right? So they're like, you know, divestment, I think will change more like the politics and the national conversation rather than like how much money there is available. Yeah, but it's complex. So I think it's hard to predict what could happen.
Hi, I don't know if Musab is having trouble with his connection. I'm also just noticing that we're coming up on 6 o'clock. There are still lots of questions, but I think that we committed to an hour. There are some really good questions. Maybe I'll throw out one last question. So do you know of any efforts being made to deal with the non-biodegradable waste of used solar panels and other renewable, hardware sources, and how innovation might play into that in the future?
Yeah, that is interesting. There are definitely, people are aware that it is a problem, especially for wind turbines. So wind turbines apparently are made of this polymer that is extremely difficult to dispose of. And as like the sort of 1.0 wind turbines are being taken offline, they're realizing that they don't know what to do with them. And so I think that is a big concern for a lot of wind operators, especially in Europe, where they have a lot more focus on sustainability and like materials. They are trying to understand what can we do to change the inputs for this. So if you are in material science and you are in like a field that is relevant to this, I think it's a huge opportunity. Solar is a little bit less of a concern so far, because a lot of that material, like it's possible to recycle, so a lot of it's glass. But I do think it's an interesting, like that whole part of the sector will become more important as it just gets bigger, for sure. Lynn, the other one I'm seeing that is, maybe I could sneak in the last minute, is Brian's question on universities using endowments like renewable energy VC funds. So yes, so MIT actually, it's not endowment money and they didn't divest, but they started this cool organization called the Engine. And the Engine is essentially a VC fund that's focusing on like sustainability more broadly, but like energy, biotech, and like other sort of hard tech applications. And it's like a few $100 million VC. It's being run separately from the university, but a lot of their mandate is to help commercialize technology created in MIT's labs. So underneath this question, do I think Princeton should be doing that? Yeah, for sure. I think it'd be really cool.
And there's one last related question. Someone's saying, is the VC financing model, is that a good way to do it? Or is that sort of jeopardizing the whole equity thing? Are they always going to focus on growth or profit, just like any other company?
Yeah, Eric, I'm glad you asked this question, although it's going to be hard to answer in like 30 seconds. It's a really like personal question for me because I'm honestly thinking about this a lot of like, is this the right? I think VC, it's like too broad a category. So you have your traditional VCs that are, you're like big name, like Andreessen Horowitz or Sequoia or Union Square Ventures, right? They are profit driven and they really believe that if a company is not profitable, it does not create value. And so I think certain clean energy innovations will fit in that. So like maybe some of these software companies, some of the more consumer companies could be interesting from that lens. I do think there's a big space for funders who have other markers of success. So like a Breakthrough Energy Ventures, right? It's like their marker of success is not profit. It's like, will we reduce enough emissions over the lifetime of the fund? So I think that's really needed because it's like, it's not going to happen fast enough otherwise. And I think your question about equity is really good too. Like VC as a whole is one of the worst industries in terms of like equity, in terms of just representation, like who's at the table. And then clean energy as well is like really struggling with that, like many industries. So when you combine them, you have this very narrow set of people in San Francisco and Boston and New York who run the show. And I think there's a lot of room for alternate models. So I would be super interested in that as well.
Thank you so much. I don't know if Musab just had trouble with his connection. Anyway, this was amazing. We're just past 6 o'clock. This was super interesting, Rohit. I hope that everyone watching got as much out of it as I did. And you put in your email, so I'm sure that especially students, if you want to, there we go.
Yeah.
If you want to take advantage of Rohit's experience and super interesting career progression so far, I'm looking forward to the next stage. Reach out to him. And yeah, thank you everybody. Thank you Princeton University Energy Association, Divest Princeton. Visit our website and have a great evening. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm back, but thank you very much, Lynn, for taking over. My apologies. My internet sometimes cuts off at intermittent times. That wasn't, I guess, ideal here. But thanks, Lynn. And I just wanted to say, I guess PUEA as an organization has these events, I guess, very occasionally, probably once a month. You can follow our website, and one of our opportunities that are coming up that we'd like to invite everyone, whether it's your first time coming to one of our events, whether you're from Divest Princeton, whether you're interested in whatever aspect of energy you're interested in, we have an energy conference coming up from November 13th to November 14th. Anisha is dropping off the information right now. Its theme is gonna be, where do we go from here? We have so many things intersecting right now. The aftermath of the pandemic, the clean energy revolution, the election, and it's gonna be a lot of, I guess, really great people, including the CEO of Solstice that we just talked about. And we'd love everyone to be there. I was gonna say about this event, I really appreciated that everyone had questions and was very engaging in terms of, making this a discussion, and especially Rohit for really, I guess, moderating that discussion and answering questions. So again, this sort of dialogue, this sort of engagement and involvement is really how we're going to get there. So once again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much to everyone for doing this, and especially a big thanks to Lynn and Rohit for bringing this to our table.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prasad.